continuing with me in this study of Leviticus. I don't think we've lost too many during this time. Getting through the most unread book in the Bible, at least it's known for that. But you will be able to say, I studied Leviticus. I'm going to do something that I said I wasn't going to do this morning. I'm going to skip chapters 21 and 22 for this reason. It is to the priests. I'm going to just summarize it for you so you kind of know what it's about. And I figured since they weren't writing to you or I, that we could just talk a little bit about the application. Yeah, I don't know how well that's coming through. Anyway, these chapters talk about instructions to the priests, and they tell the priests that they are going to be kept to a higher standard. And, of course, there will be a higher reward for those priests if they keep that standard, and they will be punished more if they do not. And the application of that is to the church today, the leaders of the church who are in positions of authority, whether it's the pastors, the deacons, or whatever, are held to a higher standard, and they also will be held to a greater reward or greater punishment. That's the essence of these two chapters in about 50 words. So I'm going to move from here. I guess the sound is still struggling a little bit, but we'll get it right. I'm going to move to what I believe, and you may not, but I believe is the most exciting chapter in Leviticus. Chapter 23. In fact, it is so exciting that I'm going to spend 2 weeks here because there are 44 verses and it's quite extensive, and it's all about God's festivals and high holy days. There is so much application to us. All of these holy days are pointing to Jesus, and the applications to us are many. So that's where we're going to spend the next couple of weeks. Now, secular Jews typically do not celebrate these holy festivals, the ones here that I'm called the Lord's appointed times. There is one Jewish holiday that secular Jews celebrate. And what is that?
Yom Kippur?
Hanukkah.
Oh, Hanukkah.
Hanukkah, it is not an appointed holiday for the Jews by God. It was a self-appointed holiday about in 200 BC. During the Maccabean Wars, the menorah in the temple, they ran out of oil because they were under siege. And God, for some miracle, kept these lights, the menorah lights, burning for 8 days after the oil was gone. So it was truly a miracle. And the Jews dedicated a holiday. It wasn't appointed by God, but they dedicated a holiday called Hanukkah. And this was no doubt a miracle for 8 days. Now John, the writer John, he mentions the Feast of Dedication in Jerusalem, and all he says is that this was during the Feast of Dedication, and it was winter. That's all he says. Well, the word for dedication is Hanukkah in Hebrew. So therefore, it is the only place that Hanukkah is mentioned in the Bible, but yet it's the one that secular Jews celebrate. Why? It's their Christmas. That's when they exchange gifts. That's when we exchange gifts at Christmas. So it comes near Christmas time. In fact, if you have a Jewish friend who's a secular Jew, Hanukkah is December 2nd through 10th this year, which would be a week from this Sunday. It starts. I have a Jewish friend that I play golf with that's a secular Jew, and he's celebrating Hanukkah next week because they have some scheduling problems the following week. So I got to wish him happy Hanukkah yesterday before I left. But anyway, we're going to jump in here Is that better?
Yeah. If you
Should I
get
keep
the-
them both, or
I turned the other one.
you turned that one off? All right, I might as well take it off. Don't need this hanging on my ear if it's not working. Decoration. Okay. I owe a debt of gratitude to a fellow named Don Curtis, who's a teaching elder at Cobb Vineyard Christian Fellowship Church in Georgia. He is an expert in Leviticus and Levitical law, in fact, in the entire law. And Don has also spent attending Beth Hallel, a Messianic Jewish congregation, from 1988 to 1994. And during these 6 years, he joined with the Messianic Jews and friends celebrating all of these holidays. So he has a first-hand view of this from the actual celebration plus from his study in the scriptures. So let's jump in here. We're going to cover not every single verse in chapter 23, but we will get most of these verses in as we move along. I'm going to start in verse 2. This is after it says, "And the Lord spoke to Moses, say to the children of Israel, speak to the sons of," actually verse 2, "Speak to the sons of Israel and say to them, the Lord's appointed times which you shall proclaim as holy convocations, my appointed times are these." Does anyone know what the word holiday, where it came from or what it means?
Holy.
That's what it is, holy days. It came from two English words. One is holy and one is days. We don't think of holidays necessarily as holy days, but that's where it came from. The Lord's appointed times are festivals and holy days that commemorate significant times and events in Israel's history. They were a rich experience, according to Don Curtis, during that time. He said he was teaching the book of Revelation. As I heard the shofars blowing in the synagogue, I've been thinking about the 7 trumpet judgments. I asked myself what the association might be between the shofars and the trumpets in Revelation. And this, in part, is what this lesson is about. Let me ask you a question. How do you learn best? Do you prefer a lecture or read a book? Do you get more out of a documentary, movie, or studying the printed page? Can you learn about something abstract, or do you need hands-on experience? As with many other things, the Lord has given each of us different learning styles. This is at its core what Leviticus 23 and related scriptures have to tell us. We not only have his written word, but we have commemorative holy days to transmit truth to the young and to the old, the literate and the illiterate. The holy days tell and show the great truths of God's salvation, his love, his plans for us, and they contain things to hear, to see, to taste, and to do, and appeal to everybody. They are the holy days, but that really means that they are holidays. The celebrations are fun, mostly, but they also teach us about eternal things. From a New Testament perspective, these holidays take on a meaning much richer than the Old Testament saints could have dreamed of. And as Paul wrote to the Colossian church, therefore no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or in respect to a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day, things which are a mere shadow of what is to come, but the substance belongs to Christ. Colossians 2:16. These holidays look back in time to miracles that God performed for the world as well as the Israelites. They also look forward in time to the work of Jesus Christ occurring during the spring and fall harvest. All of these holidays we're going to look at. We'll do the spring today and we'll do the fall next week. All of them point to Christ in some way. And they also speak of God's continuous provisions for us. And together they promise God's eternal care for his people. This lesson tells the story of these events on 3 levels. The first level discusses how the holidays have been celebrated throughout the centuries. The second level discusses the sensory elements on how they teach the truth in nonverbal ways. The third level discusses how Jesus Christ fulfilled or will fulfill the substance of every one of these celebrations. How many of you are familiar with the Jewish calendar? The Jewish calendar. Not many. Having invited you to the fun, I must ask you to pause and consider the calendar through which these celebrations flow. Stick with me for a minute because we're going to kind of give you a relationship between the Jewish calendar and our calendar. This is because the Jewish calendar is very different from ours. There is no January or February to be found. Instead, the Bible refers to the first month, the seventh month, or names like Abib or Ethanim. There is no quick way to say for a particular year the 15th of Abib occurs on the 6th of April. Also, you probably won't remember anyway. Also, most of you know that October is in the fall, but do you know what season Ethanim occupies? Do you know that the Bible has another name for the month of Abib? As we have already stated, the Lord's appointed times occur through the year. The Jews, because they celebrate every year, can and do anticipate one in its season. It's part of their culture. A Jew knows that the Feast of Tabernacles occurs in the festivals through the year, has prophetic significance. To be specific, Jesus' death and resurrection are the substance of the spring holidays. His return and the establishment of his kingdom are the substance of his fall holidays. We'll see that next week. Our calendar, officially known as what? The Gregorian calendar, is based on the relative motion of the sun through the heavens. For this reason, it is sometimes called a what? A solar calendar. Listen to this. It takes 365.2524 days to complete the year. To keep the start of spring from shifting into February and March, we insert a leap day every 4 years, February 29th. This keeps the calendar and the seasons together. Consequently, the vernal and autumnal equinoxes always occur in March and September, respectively. The Jewish calendar, however, is based on the relative motion of both the moon and the sun. It is therefore called a lunar solar calendar. Since it's based on the moon, the first of every month coincides with a new moon, and the 15th of every month coincides with a full moon. In other words, each month is defined by the phases of the moon, and the Jewish calendar keeps the months and their respective seasons together by the insertion of leap months. Not days. They have 13 months. This means that most years have 12 months, but some have 13. The whole system has a 19-year cycle. By the way, it is more accurate than our solar calendar, but is more difficult to follow, as you can see. The Jewish calendar does not mark the first day of spring, summer, or winter. The primary markers in the Jewish calendar are the holidays. The modern Jewish calendar has its secular and religious forms. The secular calendar begins with the month of Ethanim. The religious calendar begins with the month of Abib. The Bible consistently uses the religious form, obviously. The first month is always Abib, and Ethanim and Abib are ancient Canaanite names for the first and the seventh month, respectively. However, beginning with the Babylonian exile, the Jews began using the Babylonian names for the month. That'll mess you up. Consequently, the post-exile biblical authors Nehemiah and Esther, we don't know who the author was, used the Babylonian names. Today's Jewish calendar also uses the Babylonian names. Now I'm going to give you just the months, not every single month, but the name of the ones where the holidays fall. The first one is Abib, and in Babylonian name is Nisan. You probably heard that. That's in the Bible. And falls in March or April, and that will be Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, and wave offerings for the first fruits. The next one, which is the third month, I guess you would call it, Sivan, and that's in May or June, and that's the Feast of Pentecost. The 7th Ethanim, or Tishra, in Babylonia, is September or October, and that's the Feast of Trumpets, the Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. And the 13th, obviously, is called Adar the 2nd, which is the leap month. Now, all these have important implications in certain passages of Scripture. For example, Passover begins on the 14th day of the month of Abib. Since the months in the Jewish calendar follow the phases of the moon, we know that this must be a full moon. Here's an interesting fact. The darkness that fell over the earth when Jesus was crucified could not, therefore, have been an eclipse of the sun, as most people say that aren't Christian. It had to be, therefore, of supernatural origin. The important thing for us to note for the study of Leviticus 23 is that the first month, Abib, occurs sometime during March or April, and the 7th month, Ethanim, occurs during September or October. Leviticus 23 tells us about a weekly celebration first, the Sabbath. It then describes several spring celebrations: Passover, Feast of Unleavened Bread, the wave offerings of first fruit, and Pentecost. And then it moves on to describe several fall celebrations: Trumpets, Day of Atonement, and the Feast of Tabernacles. By the way, there is one of these feasts that we will celebrate in the kingdom age and throughout eternity. Only one. Anybody know what that is? It's named in Zechariah. We were that. It's quite a while ago, so you don't not expect to remember. When we get to it, we'll tell you which one it is. Now, the first holy day that God appointed was the Sabbath. No surprise. And it's called Sabbath in Hebrew. It says, "For 6 days work may be done, but on the 7th day there is a Sabbath of complete rest, a holy convocation. You shall not do any work. It is a Sabbath to the Lord in all your dwellings." That's verse 3, Leviticus 23. This is taken from Genesis 2, 1-3. The Bible says, "Thus the heavens and the earth were completed and all their host. By the 7th day God completed his work which he had done, and he rested on the 7th day from all his work which he had done. Then God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it, because in it he rested from all his work which God had created." Genesis 2:1. Now, God didn't rest because he was tired. God doesn't get tired. In fact, he's 24/7. You can call on him anytime. But God rested to show us an example of what we should do, and he also rested to look at his creation. What did he say every single day up till the 7th day or the 6th day? He said, "It is good." He liked what he made. And then on the 6th day when he made man, he said, "It is very good." And then on the 7th day he rested. Sabbath means rest. The Sabbath celebration spoken of in Leviticus 23 has its roots in creation itself. God blessed the 7th day and sanctified it. And he separated it from others in kind and character. He made it holy. Because he rested after 6 days of labor, he enjoins his people to do likewise. Thus the Sabbath becomes a weekly reminder that God is the creator of all things. Whenever I read of God resting on the 7th day, I imagine him reflecting and enjoying the work that he has done. Sometimes in my prayers, I will say, "God, I hope you are looking out over your creation and looking at the good things that are happening and enjoying yourself. There's so much bad in the world. Just look at the good things sometime and say, God, I hope you're enjoying this as I am." But it helps me to understand the intended purpose of the day. As it was for God, so it can be for our children and for us. It is a day of rest from the fast-paced week. It's a day to reflect on God and his creation. It is a day to reflect on the activities. It's a day to worship and express thanks, and a day to be good to our neighbors. You know, on Sunday morning, I'm usually dressed. By the way, Tony lands at LAX at 105. Several of you asked today. She's in the air now. I assume they survived all of the uprisings that are going on in France. They had an extra gas tax, and the French people didn't like it. They didn't like it either when they raised this Macron. He's a businessman. He's not very popular right now. He raised the retirement age from 50 to 55. Can you imagine that? We're thinking about raising it from 65 to 70. Anyway, brave guy. So, in Sunday morning, I'm usually ahead of her when I go out. I'm ready. So I go outside, and I stand in the driveway, and I watch the people walking their dogs down to the beach and walking them up from the beach, and they're going down. We're on the street that leads to the beach, so everybody going down or going up passes our house. And I'm looking out, hey, the dogs even know me because I'm out there quite often. They want to turn in and get petted or whatever. But they kind of look at me like, why am I all dressed up in the driveway when this is a day of leisure? You should be down on the beach. And if they ask, I'm saying, well, I'm going to church. And I'm waiting for them to ask something else. They quickly move on. That opening doesn't work very well there because they like their day of leisure. But the Jewish Sabbath liturgy invokes images of creation, but also the moment by moment sustaining of it by God's almighty hand. As Colossians says, I love this verse. In him all things hold together. In him all things consist. Can you imagine everything evolving and there's nothing holding it together? And you would wonder every day, is it just going to fly apart? Is everything going to cease to exist? But we don't have to wonder because God's holding it together. Here's a Jewish prayer. I think it's a good one. This is, blessed are you, O Lord, our King, King of the universe, who at your word brings on the evening twilight, with wisdom opens the gates of the heavens, and with understanding changes times and varies the seasons, and arranges the stars and their watches in the sky according to your will. You create day and night. You will roll away the light from before the darkness, and the darkness before the light. And you make the day to pass and the night to approach, and divide the day from night. The Lord of hosts is your name, a God living and enduring continually. May you reign over us forever and ever. Blessed are you, O Lord, who brings on the evening twilight. I think of three words a lot of times in my prayer to thank God for. I thank him for creation, I thank him for salvation, and I thank him for consummation. In other words, he's going to bring it all together in the end. He's going to judge both the wicked and the good, and he will put people in their proper place, the place they have chosen to go. Common Christian culture until recent times observed Sunday as a special day. It was to be different from other days. Given the Sabbath roots in the creation rather than the law, this seems appropriate. The day of rest was always intended to bless mankind, according to Isaiah. The Sabbath will continue for all mankind until the two new heavens and the earth. Isaiah 66, 22 and 23 says, for just as the heavens and the new earth which I make will endure before me, declares the Lord, so your offspring and your name will endure, and it shall be from new moon to new moon, and from Sabbath to Sabbath, all mankind will come and bow down before me. For Christians, the Sabbath speaks of our future rest in the Lord. Hebrews 4, 9 to 11 says, so there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for the one who has entered his rest has himself also rested from his works, as God did from his. Therefore, let us be diligent to enter that rest so that no one will fall through following the same examples of disobedience. What continues to wreck this Sabbath concept is legalism. Time and again, it infiltrates the practice of weekly rest and turns it into a dull affair. God set aside a day for us to rest, to enjoy him and his creation, and to do good deeds to others. Without such an appointed time, we would work or play or do whatever we do 7 days a week, 365 days a year. If we did not set aside the time, we could let our relationship with God would slip away. Unfortunately, the legalists cannot be comfortable until work is defined in detail. They're kind of in the group of perfectionists. Do you know any perfectionists? They never really complete anything, they just run out of time. Because no work is ever perfect. I know of a few perfectionists, and I won't mention any names, I might get myself in trouble. But all of its roots is in creation. It's often been true in church practice. Here's a story of interest that I found and I read. It's a story told by Laurel Ingalls Wilder and in her series, Little House on the Prairie. You ever watch that?
Yes.
Maybe some of the younger people haven't, but we watched it in our family. When Grandpa was a little boy, Laura, Sunday did not begin on Sunday morning as it does now. It began at sundown on Saturday night. Then everyone stopped every kind of work or play. Supper was solemn. After supper, Grandpa's father read aloud a chapter of the Bible, while everyone sat straight and still in his chair. Then they all knelt down, and their father said a long prayer. When he said amen, they got up from their knees, and each took a candle and went to bed, with no playing, laughing, or even talking. Sunday morning, they ate a cold breakfast, because nothing could be cooked on Sunday. And they all dressed in their best clothes and walked to church. They walked because hitching up the horses was work. And no work could be done on Sunday. They must slowly and solemnly look straight ahead. They must not joke or laugh or even smile. Grandpa and his two brothers walked ahead, and their father and mother walked behind them. In church, Grandpa and his brothers must sit perfectly still for 2 long hours and listen to the sermon. They dared not fidget on the hard bench. They dared not swing their feet, as kids like to do. They dared not even turn their heads to look out the windows or the walls or the ceiling of the church. They must sit perfectly motionless and never for one instant take their eyes off the preacher. That's how I grew up. Not quite this stern, but I can tell you this. My parents were legalists. Sometimes I say they were Pharisees, but they loved the Lord with all their heart, and God bless them. I've told this story many times, but I used to get a whipping, 2 whippings on Sunday. I got one before I went to church because my dad knew I was going to talk in church. I got one after church because I did. You would have think those whippings would have stopped me from talking in church, but 2 hours is a long time. It's a wonder I ever went to church after I didn't have to. By the way, I didn't for a while. I strayed from the church, and God thankfully brought me back. When church was over, they walked slowly home. They might talk on the way, but they must not talk loudly, and they must not laugh or smile. At home, they ate a cold dinner, which had been cooked the day before, obviously. Then, all the long afternoon, they must sit in a row on a bench and study the catechism, until at last the sun went down, and thank God Sunday was over. Can you imagine growing up that way? I was close. You know, that same attitude was present in Jesus' day. A distorted view of the Sabbath, held firmly by the Jewish leadership, inhibited them from recognizing him as the Messiah. Sabbath controversies occupy all 4 Gospels. In each, the controversy hinges on Jesus' practice of healing on the Sabbath. To the Jewish leadership, healing was work and should not take place on the Sabbath. Besides, the joy expressed by those Jesus healed disrupted the sanctity of the Sabbath. Then, as in Laura's day, the observance of the Sabbath was strictly constrained by tradition. Jesus' comments about the Sabbath speak more of blessing and service than cold soup. Jesus said, "But I say to you that someone greater than Solomon is here. But if you had known what this means, I desire compassion and not sacrifice, you would have not condemned the innocent. For the Son of Man is Lord of the Sabbath." He says also in Matthew 12, how much more valuable than is a man than a sheep. So then it is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. And he also says in Mark 2:27, the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath. But the synagogue official, indignant because Jesus had healed on the Sabbath, began saying to the crowd in response, "There are 6 days in which work should be done, so come during them 6 days and get healed, and not on the Sabbath day, even if you got sick on Sunday." But the Lord answered him and said, "You hypocrites, does it not teach you on the Sabbath day to untie his ox and his donkey from the stall and lead him away to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham, as she is, whom Satan had bound for 18 years, should she not have been released from the bond on the Sabbath day?" So it's okay to show compassion on the Sabbath rather than rest. It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath. Even those who accuse Jesus of breaking the Sabbath attended to the comfort of their own animals in that day. They just could not extend the concept to people. At creation, God rested and enjoyed the work of his hands. He gave mankind a day of rest and fellowship. He gave him a day that they could do good deeds, because during the rest of the week, finding the time to do such a thing is harder. It reflects love and joy, and it should take on the characteristics of a holiday or a holy day. To close off this section, I want to tell you a story that some of you, and maybe all of you, are familiar with. It's a story of a balanced concept of the Sabbath for the Christian. The story is the man was Eric Liddell. And the movie, the story, was Chariots of Fire. I think most of you probably have seen that or read the book. It told the story about his giving up an Olympic medal opportunity because a qualifying heat for the race was to be run on Sunday. At that time, Eric Liddell rightly chose God's glory over his own. Less known is an incident that occurred shortly before he died. A brain tumor in a Japanese internment camp during World War II. The camp conditions were crowded and the young children were constantly at loose ends. There was simply nothing for them to do. Eric Liddell organized soccer games for the young people. Guess what? They played on Sunday. Perhaps he had a change of theology, but I frankly think that he found the balance between two scriptures. The first, in Isaiah 58:13, tells us, "Turn your foot from doing your own pleasure on my holy day." The second, Matthew 12:12, says, "It is lawful to do good on the Sabbath." Okay, the spring holy days. Didn't think I'd ever get there. First one is Passover. It's called Pesach in Hebrew. Any of you ever had a Seder meal? A Seder meal? Our youngest daughter, Julie, she has done several Seder meals for her family, teaching them and instructing them on how the Jews still do it today, or did it back then. And also, there's the whole story of the Exodus and the parting of the Red Sea. All of these things come into that story. She's never invited me, so I never attended, but I'm sure her children, which are 6, by the way, benefited greatly from it. In the first month, on the 14th day of the month at twilight, is the Lord's Passover. That's verse 5 in Leviticus 23:5. Here's the background in Exodus 12, verse 1 through 14. Now the Lord said to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, "This month shall be the beginning of the months for you. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, on the 10th month of this month they are to teach each one to take a lamb for themselves, according to the father's household, a lamb for each household. But now if the houseful is too small for a lamb, then he and his neighbor nearest to his house are to take one according to the number of persons, according to what each man should eat. You are to divide the lamb. Your lamb shall be unblemished, male a year old. You shall take it from the sheep or from the goats. You shall keep it until the 14th day of the same month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation of Israel is to kill it at twilight. Moreover, they shall take some of the blood and put it on the 2 doorposts on the lintel of the houses in which they eat it. They shall eat the flesh that same night, roasted with fire, and they shall eat it with unleavened bread and bitter herbs. Do not eat any of the raw or boiled at all with water, but rather roasted with fire, both its head and its legs and its entrails. And you shall not leave any of it over until morning. But whatever is left of it until morning, you shall burn with fire. Now you shall eat it in this manner, with your loins girded, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. And you shall eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover. For I will go through the land of Egypt on that night, and will strike down all the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast. Remember, the firstborn of the beasts were also struck dead. And against all the gods of Egypt I will execute judgments. I am the Lord. The blood shall be a sign for you of the houses where you live. When I see the blood, I will pass over you. I think that's a song, isn't it? And no plague will befall you or destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt. Now this day will be a memorial to you, and you shall celebrate it as a feast to the Lord throughout your generations. You are to celebrate it as a permanent ordinance. The first month, Abib, in Hebrew means green. It suggests the singular expression of spring, the regreening or rebirth of the earth. For Israel, Passover means their birth as a nation. What is our equivalent? Independence Day, the 4th of July. For this reason, although Leviticus gives only a few words to this holy day, Passover is the king of them all. By the way, chapter 16 goes into more detail than this chapter on it. It is by reason of Passover that Abib marks the beginning of the sacred Jewish calendar. As the Lord told Moses, this month is to be the first month of the year for you. This is fitting because Passover marks the beginning of the nation of Israel. When Moses commanded the congregation of Israel concerning the first Passover, they were still slaves in Egypt. The day following the Passover meal, they were free. The story elements are familiar. The Lord's call to Moses from the burning bush. Moses, before Pharaoh, said, "Let my people go." You know, I always wondered why Pharaoh would allow this guy, the shepherd of a guy, to walk in before him and challenge him. Well, as Moses was an icon, you remember, in Egypt. He was to be the next Pharaoh. And one of his best buddies, I believe it was Ramses, ended up being the next Pharaoh because, remember, he killed one of the Egyptians and had to flee. So he was an icon there. And I think Pharaoh was a little bit afraid of this guy, so he put up with a lot. The 10 plagues and parting of the sea, Passover is a holiday for remembering these things. The Jewish celebration combines sights, words, songs, and taste to communicate the story. The telling of the story surrounds a festive meal and contains the basic elements. Tony and I were in Israel twice, in fact, but the first time we went, you're kind of startled by when Saturday night at 6 o'clock, everything kind of shuts down. Everything comes to a halt. You don't see cars moving, and people are just, you know, secular Jews are moving around a little bit, but even them respect the Sabbath. So we got up into our room, and we are looking out the window. We hear this music, and we hear these voices, and we look, and there was a tennis court and basketball court out there that were filled with people playing instruments and dancing and singing. They were really having a good time. We just enjoyed that. Went on for a couple of hours. They know how to recreate themselves. Let's look at the elements. 4 cups of wine. Although not mentioned in Exodus 12, the Passover in modern times and the time of Jesus was drinking 4 cups of wine. Now you may say, why didn't they get drunk? 4 cups of wine is a lot. Well, they did this over a period of time. These cups stand for the fourfold deliverance spoken by God in Exodus. It says, "Say therefore to the sons of Israel, I am the Lord, and I will bring you out from under the burdens of the Egyptians, and I will deliver you from their bondage. I will also redeem you with an outstretched arm and with great judgments. Then I will take you for my people, and I will be your God, and you shall know that I, the Lord your God, who brought you out from the burdens of the Egyptians. Exodus chapter 6. The first cup speaks of our being brought out. The second speaks of our deliverance from bondage. The third speaks of our redemption. And the fourth speaks of our belonging. The Gospel of Luke records the first and the third cups during the Last Supper. Jesus, and he said to them, I have earnestly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I shall never again eat it until it is fulfilled in the kingdom of God. And when he had taken the cup and given thanks, he said, take this and share it among yourselves. For I say to you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine from now on until the kingdom of God comes. And then he had taken some bread and given thanks. He broke it and gave it to them, saying, and this is what we do in our taking the Lord's Supper, this is my body which is given for you. Do this in remembrance for me. And in the same way he took the cup after they had eaten, saying, this cup which is poured out for you is the new covenant in my blood. Luke 22:15. I meant to mention earlier, but let me mention it now. Hanukkah was not an appointed holiday from God. Christmas is not an appointed holiday from God. We celebrate Christmas as a holy day because it's the birth of our Savior. Jesus never told us to celebrate his birth. He told us to celebrate what? His death. We understand this as meaning that Jesus did not inaugurate something new when he established communion, but rather identified and extended an existing tradition to communicate truth about himself. The cup immediately after the meal was the cup of redemption. To Jesus and to us, it symbolizes the new covenant and our redemption by his blood from slavery to sin. Unleavened bread. We know what that is. In the Exodus story, there is no time to let the bread rise. Before the Israelites had to leave Egypt, unleavened bread represented the speed of their salvation. It also speaks of sinlessness. Let me ask you a question. Once you said yes to God, how long did it take you to get saved?
Happened.
In the moment, in the twinkling of an eye. You know, we, the ladies, have to bear a child for 9 months. Sometimes it takes hours and hours to deliver that child. We become born again just like that. One interesting practice during the Passover celebration is the breaking of one of 3 pieces of unleavened bread. I didn't know this before. The first half is used immediately, but the second is wrapped in a cloth hidden until after the meal. This is the bread that Jesus broke during the Last Supper. It speaks of his sinless perfection. The second piece, wrapped, hidden, and resurrected, speaks of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. Now the bitter herbs. Tasting the bitter herbs are kind of like horseradish. Some of you may like horseradish. It makes me sneeze just getting near it. It's strong. It's an experience that brings tears to the eyes and is a dramatic reminder of the bitterness of slavery. It was eaten on the unleavened bread. So it can also speak of the bitter herbs of Jesus' tears in Gethsemane and the bitterness of his death for mankind's sin. The lamb. Since the destruction of Jewish temple in 70 AD, the Jews do not eat roasted lamb during Passover. Instead, they commemorate the lamb with the roasted shank bone of a lamb. The lamb represents protection against the last plague that befell the Egyptians. Or the angel of death would have slain all the firstborn of the Israelites if they didn't have the blood on the doorpost. And by the way, we're not told that there was, but there could have been some that didn't put the blood on the doorpost. On seeing the blood, the angel of death passed over the house. From this, the celebration gets its name. By the way, I think I mentioned to you a few weeks ago that there were Egyptians and foreigners in the group of the Israelites that came out of slavery in Egypt. They had learned about the Almighty God, the true God of Israel. They had joined them. They put the blood on the doorpost and they came out with them. So there could have been some Jews that did not. The other elements in the Passover celebration, there's a mixture of apples, wine, nuts, and honey called cheroseth. The apples are grated and left exposed to turn brown. Consequently, the mixture looks a little like the mud the Israelites used to make bricks. An apple will look like that if you cut it open or leave it open. There is some green vegetables like parsley or celery to speak of the spring and hope. There is salt water that represent tears. There are 10 drops of wine dipped from the second cup to represent the 10 plagues of the Egyptians. That 10 drops lower the volume of wine in the cups and indicate that the suffering of the Egyptians reduces our joy. And there's multi-sensory learning, sweet, bitter, and salty taste for the mouth, dripped wine, broken bread, and so forth are devices to teach the deliverance of God in a unique way. It appeals to all the ages. Jesus in the Passover. During the Last Supper, Jesus appropriated elements of the Jewish Passover. That is, he endowed them with new meaning, and that meaning was tied to himself instead of meaning restricted to God's past judgments. These elements now symbolize the redemption of Jesus Christ as Lamb of God who takes away the sin of the world. In his death at Calvary at Passover, the old and the new covenants meet. He is a lamb without defect. He is the broken bread. He's the cup of redemption. As he said in Luke, he will not partake of the Passover again until he could share it with us in the coming kingdom. The hand of God delivered from slavery in the past. On the cross, he delivered slavery from sin. Here's something interesting. The early church clearly identified Jesus with the Passover. Here's what Paul says, 1 Corinthians 5. Your boasting is not good. Do you not know that a little leaven leavens the whole lump of dough? Clean out the old leaven so that you may be a new lump, just as you are in fact unleavened, for Christ is our Passover, also has been sacrificed. Therefore let us celebrate the feast not with old leaven, not with the leaven of malice and wickedness, but with the unleavened bread of sincerity and truth. Leaven, we know, represents sin. Allowing sin in our lives and the church has a corrupting influence. But we are unleavened because Christ, our Passover, has been sacrificed. Thus we see Jesus completes the promise of Passover. The suggestion in Paul's words, let us celebrate the feast, implies the early Christians celebrated Passover for quite a while to come. In fact, if you remember in the Corinthian church, 1 Corinthians 12, they were eating of the Passover feast. Then they were getting drunk on wine, and they were gluttons, and they didn't allow people that wanted to come in and have any food. And Jesus said, for this, some of you are sick and some of you even die. You know, desecrating the Lord's table is a very serious thing. And Paul certainly warns of that. But they were keeping the feast as they did for many years. So why would Paul use the term feast and intend an ambiguous reading? Certainly he didn't. Feast of unleavened bread, and I'm going to go through this quickly because my time is running out, and I'll just pick up next week where I'll leave off to finish all of these different appointed holidays. On the 15th day of the same month, there is the feast of unleavened bread to the Lord. For 7 days you shall eat unleavened bread. On the first day you shall have a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work, but for 7 days you shall present an offering by fire to the Lord. On the 7th day is a holy convocation. You shall not do any laborious work. That's verses 6 through 8 in Leviticus 23. This next passage in Exodus 12, 15 through 20 is a follow-up of that, which I'm going to skip. Exodus 13, 8, 9 says, you shall tell your son on that day, saying, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I came out of Egypt, and it shall serve as a sign to your hand, as a reminder on your forehead, that the law of the Lord may be in your mouth. For with a powerful hand the Lord brought you out of Egypt. By the way, the Feast of Unleavened Bread is just an extension of Passover. It starts on the very next day and lasts 7 days. The celebration is simple. Before it begins, You pass through your entire house to clear out all your leavening agents and foods made with leaven. Leavening agents are yeast, baking powder, baking soda, sourdough. Leaven makes bread and rolls rise and makes them soft. I'm trying to figure out a good place to stop here. And I'm going to pick this place to stop because it would probably take me too long to finish. Let me say this. We'll finish up next week. We left off in verse 8, and there's 44 verses, but we will pick up clumps of scripture next week to finish out the rest of these. I'm going to close by saying there are 4 things I pray for before I come up here every Sunday. Number 1, I pray that I would be accurate. The most important thing for me is to be accurate with the Word of God. Occasionally I'll make a mistake. One of you will point it out to me, and I appreciate it. It doesn't offend me at all. In fact, I'll thank you for it, so do it. The second thing I pray for is to make the message clear so that everybody understands it. Otherwise, if it's muddled, it doesn't do us any good. The third thing I pray is it will be relative to our lives, have meaning to our lives. And the fourth thing I pray, and I say, if you please, if it is your will, please make it interesting. Someone who I told that to, I think it was president of Biola University, he says, well, that's the most important part. And I said, why? He says, if it isn't interesting, no one's going to listen. But he said, let me ask you a question. How do you know if it's interesting? I said, well, first of all, it has to be interesting to me. If it doesn't interest me, I'm not going to be very good. Secondly, I can look at their faces and tell if it's interesting. If you're going to sleep, I know it's not very interesting. So God bless you all, and we will finish this chapter next week, Leviticus 23. There's some really good things in the back part of this chapter, so come back and see us through. God bless you.